They laughed at American soldiers, called them weak, spoiled, soft men who lived on chocolate and comfort, not courage. But when German troops finally faced them on the battlefield, the laughter stopped. Because what they met wasn't weakness. It was an army that learned faster, fought harder, and never stopped coming. From the burning deserts of Africa to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the so-called soft Americans would shatter one of the greatest myths of the war and redefine what real strength looked like, the myth of the soft American. In the heart of Nazi Germany, a myth was born and fed like fuel to a fire. It told soldiers that the Americans were not real fighters, that they were spoiled sons of a lazy nation, factory boys, jazz listeners, men who lived on cigarettes and chewing gum. Posters showed them lounging with Coca-Cola bottles, not rifles. Speeches thundered that comfort had made the United States soft, that a country so young, so indulgent, could never endure the hardships of real war. Around barracks and mess halls, laughter echoed. German officers mocked the dollar soldiers, claiming they'd collapse at the first sight of blood. They said American tanks were clumsy, their soldiers slow, their morale fragile. They can build machines, one propaganda paper wrote, but they cannot build men. Even on the front lines, the myth endured. Veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by the brutality of Russia, looked west with scorn. Facing Americans, they believed, would be a break, a chance to fight men who knew nothing of hunger, cold, or fear. But beneath the arrogance, there was curiosity. What if the stories were wrong? What if these factory boys, these men of comfort, were different than they'd been told? No one dared to ask that out loud. Mockery was safer than doubt. So the myth lived on, carried proudly into battle by men who believed that the Americans were not warriors, but tourists, unprepared, undisciplined, unworthy of respect. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Propaganda and pride. Before the first shot was ever fired between the two armies, the war for perception had already been won, in Germany's mind. The Ministry of Propaganda, led by Goebbels, made sure of it. Newspapers printed cartoons of overweight American soldiers slipping in mud, dropping their rifles, begging for rations. Radios blared that America's soldiers fought only for money, that their hearts were as soft as their beds back home. Teachers told young recruits that a single German was worth 10 Americans, and those recruits believed it. By 1942, that pride was all they had left. Germany's cities were darkened by bombings, its supply lines stretched thin, its people weary. But the illusion of superiority, of being forged in hardship, kept morale alive. They looked at American abundance and saw decay, not strength. They mocked the smiles of GIs in photographs, the polished boots, the rations packed with sweets. In private, though, whispers began to spread. Officers who had studied abroad before the war spoke cautiously of American industry, of its limitless resources, of how its people could turn factories overnight into war machines. Those words were dismissed as defeatism. So the pride continued to swell. Soldiers marched into Africa and Europe with certainty in their hearts that the Americans were untested, naive boys in shiny helmets. They thought the war would prove it, but the battlefield would speak a language propaganda couldn't control. And soon the men who had laughed at American soldiers would be staring down the barrels of their rifles, realizing too late that the myth of the soft American had been built on sand. First contact in North Africa. The desert was supposed to be easy. When Rommel's veterans heard they'd be facing Americans in North Africa, they almost laughed. To them, the U.S. Army was an experiment, a collection of amateurs dressed in new uniforms, led by generals who'd never tasted real combat. German confidence was unshakable. They had crushed the French, held off the British, and bled the Soviets on the Eastern Front. Facing Americans, that sounded like a vacation. At first, the arrogance seemed justified. In early battles like Kasserine Pass in 1943, Green American troops struggled against Rommel's seasoned panzer divisions. German tanks cut through thin defenses, and their artillery outranged the inexperienced Allied guns. Prisoners were taken by the hundreds, many dazed and confused by the chaos. German officers mocked them, calling them children playing soldier. But even in victory, something about these Americans unsettled the veterans. They fought clumsily, yes, but they fought hard. Even under heavy fire, they refused to break completely. Captured American gear was examined with curiosity. Simple, reliable weapons, sturdy trucks, and endless supplies. It was the first hint that these weren't amateurs, they were learners. When the dust settled, the Germans laughed again, but this time, a little less loudly. Reports filtered in that American units regrouped faster than expected, that their air cover was relentless, and that their logistics, their endless convoys of fuel and ammunition, never seemed to stop. One officer wrote home that the Americans make mistakes quickly and learn even faster. Kasserine had humbled the Americans, yes, but it had also awakened them. And the Germans, though they didn't yet know it, had just faced an enemy that would soon grow stronger than they could ever imagine. The shock of real combat. By mid-1943, the laughter was gone. The same Americans once mocked for weakness began returning to the battlefield with a cold precision. Their new commanders, men like Patton, drilled them until every mistake was burned out. The Americans who faced the Germans now were no longer boys, they were soldiers. When US forces launched their counteroffensives in Tunisia, the change was unmistakable. The artillery was faster, the airstrikes more coordinated, and the infantry no longer hesitated under fire. They attacked with aggression, not the wild bravery of desperation, but a steady mechanical confidence. German veterans began to notice it in their eyes. Determination, not arrogance. The first real shock came when entire American divisions advanced through fire that would have broken most armies. They didn't retreat, they adapted. German officers began to whisper that fighting the Americans felt like fighting a machine, slow to start, impossible to stop once moving. Their supply chains seemed endless. Their tanks arrived faster than they could be destroyed. Even Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, admitted to his staff that the Americans were beginning to understand the art of war. By the time the Africa Corps began its final retreat toward Tunisia's coastline, many German soldiers stopped laughing altogether. They no longer called the Americans soft, they called them relentless. In the blazing desert sun, surrounded by the wrecks of panzer tanks and the rumble of American Shermans pushing forward, they realized something that no propaganda could erase. The so-called soft Americans had found their footing, and once they did, they were unstoppable. Normandy and the humbling advance. By the summer of 1944, the myth of the soft American was collapsing under the weight of cold, hard reality. When the Allies landed in Normandy, German troops watched the beaches erupt into chaos, smoke, fire, and bodies. But amid the horror, something struck them. The Americans didn't stop. Machine guns tore through their ranks. Artillery shattered the sand, yet wave after wave kept coming. Soldiers waded through water red with blood, dragging wounded comrades, advancing yard by yard under relentless fire. The Germans had expected panic. What they saw instead was discipline. The young men who had once stumbled in Africa now moved with purpose, covering each other, calling for medics, keeping their formations even as shells exploded around them. Behind the beaches came the full weight of American power, columns of tanks, convoys of supplies, aircraft roaring overhead in endless waves. German defenders fought ferociously, but for every position they held, another barrage followed. Their lines began to crumble, not because of weakness, but because they were being crushed by an enemy that fought like an industrial storm. Captured soldiers later said that Normandy was the moment they understood the truth. American courage wasn't loud or theatrical. It was steady, mechanical, unyielding. These were men who didn't fight for glory or ideology. They fought because it had to be done, and they would keep fighting until it was. In the hedgerows of Normandy, German arrogance finally met American persistence. The result wasn't just defeat, it was disbelief. The spoiled men of comfort had turned into one of the most determined armies the world had ever seen. The Battle of the Bulge. Winter 1944. The Ardennes, Germany's last desperate gamble. Hitler's plan was simple: smash through the thinly held American lines, split the Allies, and force the West into panic. The Germans believed the Americans couldn't handle the cold, couldn't endure surprise, couldn't fight without comfort. The propaganda machine called it the soft man's winter. When the offensive began, snow and fog cloaked the forests. The first attack stunned the Americans. Artillery thundered. Tanks rolled through the mist. Entire divisions were encircled. Once again, German confidence flared. The soft Americans are running, but they didn't. In Bastogne, surrounded and outnumbered, the 101st Airborne refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General McAuliffe sent back one word: nuts. It became legend. American troops dug into frozen ground, sharing rations, firing until their weapons jammed from the cold. And when the skies finally cleared, the storm of Allied air power returned, obliterating German columns, cutting their supply lines, turning the proud offensive into retreat. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a German triumph, but with shattered divisions limping back through snow, harassed at every turn by the enemy they once mocked. American soldiers marched forward again, mud-stained, frostbitten, exhausted, but victorious. For the Germans who faced them, the myth was gone for good. They had called them soft. But in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, they saw a kind of endurance no propaganda could explain, the stubborn, unbreakable strength of ordinary men who refused to fall. The realization. By 1945, the laughter had vanished completely. The war that was supposed to prove German superiority had instead revealed something they could never admit out loud. The Americans weren't soft, they were unstoppable. German soldiers began to see it everywhere. In the way US convoys stretched for miles without end. In the skies filled with bombers flying in perfect formation, protected by squadrons of fighters that never seemed to run out of fuel. In the sheer organization of an army that could replace what it lost overnight. They saw it in the eyes of the soldiers they fought too. Young men who fought not for ideology but for each other. Men who could crack jokes in foxholes, then charge through artillery fire the next minute. There was no fanaticism, no blind worship of flags or leaders, just an almost casual determination to win. That, more than anything, terrified the Germans. For the first time, many began to question what they had been told. If this was weakness, what did strength look like? If this was softness, why did it keep crushing them? Letters home grew quieter. Some stopped bragging altogether. Others confessed in rare moments of honesty that they respected their enemies more than their superiors. As Germany's borders shrank and cities turned to rubble, the soldiers who had once mocked America found themselves surrounded, outgunned and outmatched. They had believed propaganda that called the Americans spoiled, lazy, and dependent on machines, yet those same machines now rolled through their homeland, driven by men who refused to stop. The myth was dead. And for the German soldier staring down another relentless American advance, the truth was finally clear. They had underestimated not a nation of comfort, but a nation of quiet, efficient power. Captivity and reflection. When surrender finally came, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like awakening. Thousands of German soldiers laid down their weapons and marched into American captivity. Expecting cruelty, humiliation, or starvation, they braced themselves for revenge. But instead, they found order, food, even kindness. The same enemy they had once mocked fed them warm meals, gave them clean beds, medical care, and even books to read. For men raised on stories of American decadence, this was almost impossible to process. They looked around the camps, organized, efficient, humane, and realized they were being treated better by their captors than by their own commanders. The irony cut deep. Some were ashamed, others were grateful, and many simply sat in silence, unable to reconcile the image of the soft American with the reality they were now living. Guards smiled. Prisoners were addressed by rank, not insult. And even in captivity, American strength was everywhere. In the precision of logistics, the abundance of food, the calm authority of a system that didn't need cruelty to maintain control. For some Germans, this treatment planted a seed. Maybe strength wasn't born from hardship or ideology. Maybe it came from something quieter, confidence, fairness, discipline without brutality. By the time many of them were released, they carried home not just memories of battle, but a new kind of respect. The Americans had proven that mercy could be mightier than fear, and that true strength doesn't shout, it simply endures. Conclusion: the strength they mocked. In the end, the story of the soft American became one of the greatest ironies of the war. What began as laughter ended as silent respect. The men who had mocked America's comfort, its easy living, and its abundance, had come face to face with something they never expected, a strength that didn't need to prove itself through cruelty or suffering. The Americans fought differently. They didn't fight for conquest or ideology. They fought to end the war and go home. They brought with them a strange kind of confidence, born not from desperation but from belief, that freedom itself was worth fighting for, and that belief gave them an endurance no propaganda could break. For the Germans, that realization came slowly, first in the desert, then in the hedgerows, and finally in the snow. Each battle stripped away the illusions built by years of speeches and slogans. The spoiled soldiers of comfort had marched across oceans, across continents, across fear itself, and won. In captivity, that truth sank even deeper. The meals, the order, the dignity, it all revealed a power greater than weapons. America's true weapon wasn't just its factories, its tanks, or its planes. It was its humanity. The quiet discipline of men who could show mercy without weakness and strength without hate. Many German prisoners carried that memory home. They spoke of the enemy who fought hard but treated them fairly, the enemy whose strength lay not in brutality, but in calm assurance. Some even stayed, building new lives in the land they had once mocked. Because in the end, they discovered what their propaganda had never told them. The Americans were never soft. They were strong enough to fight with power and still have mercy left to give.